Brett, welcome to Beyond the Tools.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate you asking.
So, Brett, we've known each other a long time, and I've been so excited to have this conversation today because naturally, people that are neurodivergent tend to gravitate towards entrepreneurship and towards the trades. So, while this isn't our typical topic here on the show, I think it's really, really important, and there are so many misconceptions about ADHD. So, I'm excited to have you here.
And you're right. I mean, ADHD doesn't discriminate. It exists across all careers, all lifestyles, all cultures. So there's really not a place that when we look into it that it won't touch. I mean, roughly 6% of individuals, they say adults have ADHD. I actually think the number now would be a little higher. I think there are a lot of undiagnosed cases and that sort of thing. But yeah, it spreads. It doesn't discriminate. So it's applicable in any industry. Learning how to deal with this and learning how to get the most out of the people that you may be involved with, whether an employee, a spouse, a family member, whatever, how to help them get the most out of themselves because they have latent abilities in many cases that will just blow your mind when they're put in the right situations.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Brett, I think having your story is such a key component here because I think a lot of people relate to that. So, can you take us back to when you were 42 and finally got your diagnosis?
So, yeah, I started seeing a counselor at that time. I was working in marketing with the provincial government at the time, and everything was going well in my life. I mean, I had a great job, I had kids, I had a wife, I had a home. Everything was going well, seemingly. Inside, there was a lot of turmoil. And so I started seeing a counselor for a while. And after a little while, she kind of suggested, have you ever thought about ADHD? And I kind of went, I know what ADHD is. ADHD is the kid that couldn't stay still in class when I was in fifth grade. That's not just what ADHD is, it turns out. And the more I looked into it, the more it became very obvious to me that, yeah, this was an issue for me. So I received my diagnosis when I was 42. That was years ago. And but I received my diagnosis when I was 42. And post-diagnosis was weird because you find this out. First of all, you get tagged with this thing that's called a deficit disorder, and so you start thinking to yourself, like, where's the deficit? What's the disorder? I know I feel like I'm not doing what I should be, but like that's a hell of a thing to get tagged with. And on the one hand, it was great to have this realization, and on the other hand, it was the only way that I can describe it is that you go through a period of mourning. That's the best way I can describe it. I mean, what are the stages of mourning? Denial, anger, negotiation, depression, acceptance. And I think that's exactly where I was. I mean, it's at first it's like, I don't have ADHD. There's no way I have ADHD, And then you start to get kind of pissed about the fact that if I had known I had ADHD when I was 12, how much different could my life have been?
Yeah.
You really start, and what I realized after a while was that I was actually mourning the person who didn't exist that I thought I could have been. Had I learned earlier. I had been successful. I had done lots of things. As a matter of fact, I had been successful in some cases against the odds. But at the same time, there's this missing piece that suddenly you find out, you get this insight, and what the hell could my life have been? So that went on for probably close to 3 years. Just kind of exploring it, learning more about it, certainly. And the more I learned, the more I realized the positives that come with it, the more I realized how much of who I am is actually a result of my ADHD and not in spite of it. And at one point, somebody asked me a question, said, if you could take a pill tomorrow and your ADHD would be gone, would you take that pill? The answer is no. I wouldn't. I wouldn't even consider it at this point in my life. It took me a long time to get there, and that's what I call radical acceptance.
Yeah.
When you get to the point where you start to see yourself as a whole. And I use a term called the centered self, to try to become the centered self, where you live your life from the inside out as opposed to the outside in. And then I just kind of thought, and it was after a conversation with my sister where, we got into a pretty deep conversation. She said, Brett, you've learned a lot about this stuff and you've gained a lot of insight. Maybe you can help other people.
Yeah.
And at the time I was smack dab in the middle of a marketing career. I had actually recently left a job and came from an interview for another job, walked into the house with, I guess, a look on my face that said it didn't go well. And my wife said, well, I guess that didn't go well. And I went, no, it went very well. The job's mine if I want it. And she said, well, what's the problem? I don't want it. I don't want it. What do you want? And I literally said, I want you to jump off a cliff with me, hold my hand on the way down, and I ain't wearing a parachute. And that's when I tossed my life upside down and became an ADHD coach.
Wow.
So I trained with ADCA, an organization out of Albany, New York. 2 levels of training, a basic level and an advanced level. I hung my shingle and opened up my practice in between those 2 programs. To my mind, when I finished the initial program, my goal was to gain experience before I went into the next program, and to try to get some practical application and stuff. And then I did my advanced training, and the rest is history. I started out, just with local clients, literally hanging my sign in pharmacies and doctors' offices and, boots on the ground, going and talking to people locally and stuff. And then eventually I connected with a couple of really valuable partnerships that spread my message a little broader, certainly. And I credit Jessica McCabe, who has a YouTube channel called How to ADHD. She's a wonderful friend of mine now. And when I started working with Jessica and I did a couple of interviews with her, things really blew up. And in the 10 years since, I've had hundreds of clients, thousands of coaching hours, literally from 6 continents, from all over the world. And different cultures, different backgrounds, all of these things, and it's been a real education. And I've learned over the years that people are people. People are people. They, there are cultural differences. There are, differences in the background, the way we grow up, the things we believe in and everything. But people have the same basic insecurities. People struggle in the same ways. People often struggle and don't verbalize that struggle. So yeah, it was really insightful, and I learned a lot that there's not it's a cliche, but there's a hell of a lot more that unites us than separates us.
Absolutely. I love that. So this, from diagnosis to operating as a full-time ADHD coach, how long was that? Did this all happen in a year, 5 years?
So it was 3 years. 3 years I kept working for the organization that I was with. So 3 years after my diagnosis, I started to get restless. I will say that it was a mutual decision that I wasn't going to continue working there. And so when I was at a point where I kind of said, okay, I'm ready for a change now. And it was basically 3 years before I started to train and to really look deeply into it and quit my job, basically, or not so much quit my job, but I didn't go back.
Yeah.
And within a year and a half after that, I had my practice set up locally. At the time, I was working out of an office. I was doing everything locally. And within another year and a half or so after that was when I had the opportunity to partner, and things really started to take off. So yeah, it was but the journey between, you're starting a business. You're starting when you've already had a career. I was not, although I was entrepreneurial minded, I was not an entrepreneur. I had never been in my life. I mean, I would consider myself an intrapreneur.
Yeah.
Somebody who's very entrepreneurial within their organization. But the idea of owning my own business was never something that crossed my mind. And there was a learning curve. Somebody told me once It's a hell of a different story when you're signing the front of the check instead of the back.
Yeah.
And I think that that's very true, and I found that out. But and I went through all the bumps, the things that you would expect to go through, trying to do too much myself, being
Mm,
afraid to firm things out, being afraid to get people. And this was when I was still going through at the very beginning. I was still going through my own process and still kind of figuring out what I was, who I was, and how I wanted to do this. And a lot of the old tendencies, the old ADHD tendencies, of not wanting to ask for help,
mm,
of thinking I should be able to do this myself, meant that I was trying to do marketing, accounting, bookkeeping, all of the back end work of the business. And I equate myself to a chef in a kitchen, in a restaurant, sorry. And the chef wants to work in the back of the house. The chef wants to cook. That's what he's good at. That's what he loves doing. It's his passion. It's the reason he opened the restaurant. He has front of the house responsibilities as well. And I think recognizing the front of the house responsibilities along with the back of the house responsibilities took me a while.
mm.
And I'm going to be honest with you, it's still not something that I love. I want to be in the back of the house. I want,
Yeah.
when I'm at my best, when I'm feeling the best, when I'm in flow is when I'm coaching, when I'm talking to my clients, when I'm actually doing the work.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to dig into that a little bit more because I think that there are all these misconceptions, of course, about ADHD. And then also, I think there are some real challenges. And I guess that I know you and I have talked about this. I'm not super public about having ADHD because of all these stigmas attached to that. And it's just not that I hide it, but I'm not,
Well, it's easy
screaming
for me.
in every social post that,
Yeah. It's
this
easy
is
for me
something.
because it's my career. It's what I
Yeah,
do.
absolutely.
You
But
know,
I think with that, when I do have those conversations with oftentimes fellow business owners, because very, very common in entrepreneurship,
we will
I
index
guess,
higher than 60% as entrepreneurs, believe me.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And oftentimes I'd say one of the most common things that I hear is like, oh yeah, I did probably have ADHD, but I don't want to get a diagnosis or I've never really looked into it. What are your thoughts on diagnosis? Is that something that really matters?
Well, I tell you, I've lived life on both sides of diagnosis. It's better on this side. I'll say that much. Look, we fear the diagnosis because we fear the stigma, and we don't understand exactly what this is. Again, it's called a deficit disorder. Well, who's eager to find out that they have a deficit disorder? I mean, the name of ADHD is just it's crazy. It does not describe the condition in any way. We don't have a deficit of attention. I actually feel like we have a surplus of attention that we just can't focus. I don't think, and our ability to focus and pay attention is dependent upon interest more than importance. It's just the way that our brain works. So, the diagnosis, it's not easy to get a diagnosis. It's not easy because many GPs are not really trained in this at all through medical school. That's changing somewhat. Primary care physicians are becoming more and more aware of this. But first of all, it's going to be difficult to find a doctor who has enough knowledge to be able to either perform the diagnosis themselves or make a referral to someone who can.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I will say this, look, the diagnosis opened up opportunities for me. It allowed me to open up, well, first of all, it was a huge self discovery. So it was, as I look back now, this many years later, it was hugely beneficial to get the diagnosis. And the other thing that it opens up to you is first of all, medication is not the be all end all. It does
Mm-hmm.
not cure ADHD. There is no cure for ADHD. We will have ADHD if we have it. It is a great management tool, okay, for those for whom it works. For about 20% of the population, just for reasons of individual biochemistry, stimulant medication will have no impact whatsoever. And then there are some people who respond very poorly to it. And there are people who respond very positively to it. And there's a lot of different options and stuff. But I remember, I'll tell just a quick story. The first day I took my medication, I went to work. And there had been an RFP that had been sitting on my desk for a request for proposal that had been sitting on my desk for 6 months, or 6 weeks. And I hadn't touched it. I had tried to touch it. And things were getting dicey. It was getting close to the deadline and stuff like that. I went in that morning after I took my medication, and I finished that RFP that day. And I attended a meeting that day. And I remember walking out of the meeting and for the first time thinking, I listened to everything that was going on in there. I didn't get lost. My mind wasn't wandering. Now, that's a bit of a honeymoon period at the very beginning when you start taking the medication and stuff. And the honeymoon period where you see the sharp distinction between how you were and how you are doesn't last long. We get used to a new normal pretty quickly. And in fact, after about 6 weeks or so, I remember going back to my psychiatrist and saying, you know what, I'm doing well, and I don't think this medication is really doing a whole lot for me. I'm not sure I have ADHD. I'm not sure that I need this. And she said, and the great thing about ADHD medication is that you can just stop taking it. It's not something you have to wean yourself off or anything like that. So she just said, well, stop taking the meds. So I go, yeah, sure, okay. So I stopped taking the meds, and about 5 days later, I went back and saw her, and I went, yeah, I have ADHD, and I know.
Yeah.
Because I very quickly realized that I'd gone back to my own self. Now, I don't like to talk too much about meds because, it is not the be-all, end-all. It's not the only way to approach ADHD. I wrote an article a few years ago for Attention magazine called The Non-Meds Approach to ADHD. And basically what it highlighted was mindfulness, exercise, diet, and sleep, which spells meds. The problem is that most individuals with ADHD really have difficulty with I hesitate to say discipline, but the ability to be able to really conquer those four things.
Yes.
Will alone is very difficult to try to do that. So the medication can be a great assistive technology. And the meds have gotten so much better and stuff, and there's so many different options right now. So I may have gone off on a tangent there. Surprise, surprise.
I mean, that's what we're here for, right? And yeah, I think you're absolutely right there in that I always say I hate routine and structure, but I need routine and structure to survive.
I always say that most people with ADHD, we hate routine as an adjective. We love routine as a noun.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because mundane routine things will drive us crazy. But having established routines, the more we leave to chance in our life, the more possibility there is that everything will be coming at us from all different directions. So if you establish certain routines, I think of part of ADHD at least as having 4 gigs of RAM in a world where everybody else has 64, 128. Something like that. So it's not that we're not able to process equally. It's that typically our processing speed will be impacted, and our ability to be able to process multiple things at one time. So if I've got 10 tabs open on my computer and I've got 4 or 8 gigs of RAM in my computer, that's going to cause a problem. And if I start closing tabs, then my memory, is able to handle what I've got going on. Well, we need to close tabs. We need to close some of the stuff that's happening in our mind that we're carrying with us. It's one of the reasons why we, individuals with ADHD, tend to, whether they realize it or not, crave certainty beyond anything else. Certainty is peace. And when we have certainty, we don't have to ruminate. We don't have to think about things. So every little piece of life that we can put over here and say, I'm certain about that, it's really a weight lifted off us. So as a result of that, we spend most of our life trying to be certain, trying to court certainty. And life is inherently uncertain. And we can establish certain amounts of certainty in our life. We have to leave certain things to chance. And I always like to talk about certainty as a set of audio sliders. If you've seen the sliders on a mixing board. And we make adjustments between the two factors that influence certainty. And one is control and the other is trust. And these two sliders, we manipulate those back and forth. As we index lower on control, we will want to index higher on trust. As we index lower on trust, we're going to want to index higher on control, And when we're not able to index higher on either trust or control, then we have to accept that this is an inherently uncertain situation. We can't gain either increased trust or increased control. And then we have to accept that. We've got to move on. I mean, acceptance is a big part of how to deal with this.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I want to pause you there because I'm very interested in this concept here. Yeah, yeah. And I guess specifically, how do you see that applying when you run a business or manage a team?
I think it works as a good litmus test, quite honestly. It's like, it's worked well for my clients in that when they find themselves, once they're conscious enough, and building consciousness is a huge piece of this, that's how I start with most people, is trying to build consciousness, become a little more self-aware, start thinking about how we're thinking, not just what we're thinking, that sort of thing. And what I've determined is that using this as a litmus test for certainty, knowing the huge piece that certainty plays in our life, if we can get to a place where we don't need to question whether we can attain certainty here or not, where we can be certain whether or not, look, there's just nothing to be gained here. There's nothing, there's nothing here I can trust, and there's no more control that I can get, then we can then attack that at least as an inherently uncertain situation. If we use the sliders appropriately and we say, where can I gain trust? Maybe we can gain some trust. The key is that we don't just look for trust on the outside. We look for trust on the inside as well. Some of the trust that we're missing when we're uncertain is trust in ourselves. And we need to include that trust in that formula of trust and control. When we increase our control over something, it may not really serve us well from a workload perspective, from an overwhelm perspective, but it will give us more certainty when we are in control. So when you start playing with these things, and this is the idea with everything that I do in my coaching, it's not about here's what you need to do. It's here's a concept. Let's start playing with this. Let's see how it'll work for you. I mean, in my life, I've read self-help books over the years, and I always found the most frustrating part was that I would read the front part of the book, the first 10 chapters, and I would understand the concepts, I'd understand what it's asking me to do, and then I get to the last few chapters, and that's the implementation part. And that's where I suffered. Because it's going to be very difficult for me to follow the implementation plan of someone else. Now, I can come up with my own implementation plan as long as I understand the concepts. And to take this to an extreme, what I say to my clients all the time is, look, if you're going to use a list as just an example of a very basic tool, I could care less what that list looks like. A paper towel and an orange crayon, if that's what you want to do, you do it. Doesn't matter. We talk concepts, and I want the clients to make those concepts their own, because especially individuals with ADHD, this is true of all people, but especially individuals with ADHD and who are neurodivergent, we need to own the idea. We need to figure it out for ourselves. We're not great at just taking things and accepting them for what they are. We want to test things. And so it's really important for us to figure out our own approaches. So I don't try to come at my clients with specific approaches. I work with concepts, ideas, ways to change the way you're thinking. The other thing is that the manifestation of ADHD is as different as the individuals themselves. The underlying causes are very common across the board, but the way those causes manifest in an individual's life will be as unique as that individual themselves. So there is no carte blanche kind of cookie cutter approach here. There are tools, there are productivity tools. I'm always very keen, if somebody is looking for productivity help, I'm very keen to refer them to a productivity coach. I see myself as a mindset coach. We get to the areas of productivity, but we get there through changing the way we think about things rather than leading with changing the way we do things. So we want to create a basis for the way we think about things. We want to have a reason for changing the way we do things, and then we can implement the change and be more comfortable and certain about it.
Right. So by devising your own implementation plan, I think that goes back to, for most of us, we can't just follow something because we're told to. We need to understand the why and the purpose. And then, like you said, having control over what that looks like. That makes a lot of sense.
That's where we are as a baseline. We work on these things. We work on our need for control. While we're using these tools, we're also working on reducing the need for control and certainty in our life. While we're doing these different exercises, and while we may be implementing different tools as per the client's direction or whatever, and I help them with that, obviously, and I've got a lot of tools at my disposal that we can take and modify and so forth. We're working, so that's a baseline. We know these things. Individuals with ADHD tend to be. And we work from that to try to, first of all, address those issues while we're trying to change those issues as well. Knowing that there's a certain amount of acceptance that comes with this. Like everything that I do with my clients is based on 3 underlying principles that are really the pillars of all of my work. And that's to understand, to accept, and to embrace. We need to understand what ADHD is. We need to understand what it is not. That's very important. Understanding is the equivalent of teaching a man to fish rather than giving him fish to feed him,
So on that, and we'll come back to the other two, but on that, what is ADHD and what is it not?
So ADHD is a neurodevelopment processing style is what I would call it. I don't really see it as a disorder. I think you can put, look, if I'm in a room full of people, or if I'm in a room and I need something done right now and the backs are against the wall, chips are down, we're on a deadline, this is all urgency, I want a room full of people with ADHD. Because those people will act in that situation. Urgency is our number one, interest and urgency tend to be our primary motivators. And so there are places where an individual with ADHD can excel, right? So you need to understand that. We need to understand that, yes, there are challenges. There are things that we have problems with. At the same time, there are areas where we excel and we can add value. So we need to understand where those pieces lie. And those can change for an individual. Because it also relates to individual skills and trying to mirror and marry up your individual skills with your ADHD challenges.
Mm-hmm.
But that's where the second one really comes into play. It's a great segue. To acceptance. When I talk about acceptance, people confuse acceptance with resignation. And resignation to me is a crash mat. You fall into the resignation and you just stay there. It doesn't bounce you back, doesn't do anything. Acceptance, on the other hand, acceptance is a trampoline. The more we accept, the more we compress that trampoline down, the further we keep accepting what is, and we decide to work with that instead of against it, the further that trampoline springs us forward. So I talk about radical acceptance. Radical acceptance is, I have ADHD. That is never going to change. So as I'm walking out the door, my wife calls out to me and she says, pick up some milk and bread. I go, text me, because I am not going to remember the milk and bread. I know that as I'm walking out the door. So why have the fight later? Let's just establish a system that works. I know that if she texts me, I'm going to get the text, I'm going to remember it. Establishing, certain, I don't want to call them rules, but establishing certain processes that work for you requires acceptance. I'm not trying to beat this. I'm trying to work with it. There are a ton of different ways to do any one thing. There is no one right way to probably do anything. I stand to be corrected on that, but there's not much that there's just one singular way to do it. What we're good at is finding all of the different ways. If we allow ourselves, if we accept that, and if we allow ourselves to explore. So that's part of acceptance. Embracing is moving beyond that acceptance to actually identifying, the acceptance piece is identifying how we work, identifying what works for us, trying to use that stuff, and then if we do that, then we tend to embrace our life moving forward. We tend to embrace opportunities. We even tend to embrace challenges because we're no longer struck by, I don't know how to do this. We change our attitude to, I know how to figure out how to do this. That's a long journey. There's no doubt about it. It's a long journey, but it's a journey that, and I think it's important to understand that it's not a linear journey. And it's not a journey where you arrive at the end and that's where you are and that's where you stay. I mean, I talk about the 4 levels of competence all the time, unconscious incompetence, conscious incompetence, conscious competence, and unconscious competence. And I won't take the time to go through them, explain them now, but I think we go through, the first one, incompetence, is just we don't know what we don't know. We all kind of start out that way. We don't know what we don't know yet. But we need to learn, and as we learn, we move through those 4 stages of competency. But again, it's not linear. Something new comes along in our job, something new comes along in our life, there's a challenge all of a sudden. We're going to be thrown right back into that unconscious incompetency again. So it's really important to understand that this path of understand, accept, and embrace is not linear, and you will move back and forth through it throughout your life. But if you have a process that you can go through, if you have an ability to be conscious of when things are changing in your life, if you build that centered self, as I call it, where we don't consider ourselves first and foremost and only, we consider ourselves first and foremost and how we can mesh with the rest of the world.
How does that apply, for example, as the leader of a company? If you have a team, how do you take your centered self to work?
Yeah. I think in any case, we have to be honest with ourselves. That's really what it comes down to if you want to be a centered self, is to be honest with yourself. I was once asked to write a document that from scratch, a pitch document, where you would pitch a piece of work in marketing or whatever. I was asked to write the document, and I went, I'm not the one you need writing that document. You have people here who, quite frankly, you're paying a third of my salary, can do that 3 times better than me. Bring it back to me when they're done. I'll make it better, right? I would, if I was in that situation, so if I didn't understand myself, I would take that on, which is exactly what I used to do, is try to take on everything, right? I would take that project on. I would obsess over the format, the wording, how many paragraphs it needed to be, what the intro was going to be, how it was going to be laid out, all of these things that really have nothing to do with the content. But that's where my mind is going to go. Bring it to me already formatted. Bring me a draft, and I will see things in there that I will make better. And when you're pitching that piece of work, you want me in the room, because that's where I'm really going to shine. Without being a centered self, I can't view both my challenges and my strengths equally. And I'm going to wind up always trying to bury my challenges and always trying to accentuate my strengths. And if we merge these two and we're honest with ourselves and we're honest with the people around us, we will end up doing much better, and we will do better for other people. So if you're an employer and you have neurodivergent employees, find out what they're good at. And if you give them duties that align with what they're good at, they're really good at it, most likely. But having an open communication so that you can allow someone to say, I'm probably not the best person to do that. Bob is probably the best person to do that, based on skill set.
Yeah.
And wouldn't everybody want that sort of a work environment?
Yeah. And I think that's so interesting too, Brett, this whole concept of truly understanding how your brain works, what you're best at. That's ultimately, I think, going back to our previous conversation, that's really where diagnosis helps. And that doesn't need to be an official diagnosis. I think self-diagnosis is valid.
The problem with self-diagnosis is that there are nuances, and there's also significant comorbidity with ADHD. So it may be ADHD. It may also be combined with something else. OCD often accompanies ADHD. There are other conditions that are quite, quite common as comorbidities with ADHD. So ADHD bipolar can be mistaken for ADHD if the diagnostician doesn't understand the differences.
Fair, yeah.
That said, there are elements of the diagnostic process which really have very little to do with what it means to have ADHD. The diagnostic process really doesn't touch emotional dysregulation whatsoever, which is probably the single most significant issue that accompanies ADHD. Yes, we look at all the practical stuff. Can you pay attention? Can you focus on your work? Can you do this? Does your mind wander? Emotionally, what's going on? What's that itch that's inside that can't be scratched? Well, when you're a kid and you have that itch, you can run around all day and you can scratch it. But when you're an adult, you can't hop on the couch. So that itch goes internal and starts to become something that feels like a desire that you can't touch, something that you want to do but you can't get to it. You know, just the shortest way for me to say it is that if anyone is considering the possibility of an ADHD diagnosis, go for it.
Yeah.
It just opens up more options. It doesn't change anything for you. It doesn't. You're going to be the same person post-diagnosis as you were before, but you'll know. And expect, yeah, you may be angry. Yeah, you may be pissed off. Yeah, you may be disappointed and all those things. I mean, I think that happened to me. That happens to many people. I mean, there are people who, when they get their diagnosis, are absolutely thrilled and they just move forward. But for the most part, yeah, it's going to be painful at first. But believe me when I tell you that the other side of this thing is so much better.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it does, understanding yourself, how your brain works, what your strengths are, so that, like you said, you're not fighting ADHD, you're realizing the pros and cons of it, and yeah, you're using it.
I honestly, I think I ride my ADHD. I ride it. That's one of the reasons why I would not get rid of it if I could. I mean, all of the elements that I have that I associate with my ADHD are kind of what makes me me. It's they're the most unique parts of me, and they're the things that are, different from other people. I mean, most of our lives, when you're neurodivergent, you go through most of your life, especially if you're not diagnosed, you go through most of your life feeling like a square peg, constantly trying to fit in round holes. What many people want me to help them do is be a better round peg trying to fit into a square hole. So how do I get this round peg to fit better in the square hole? And I go, no, you don't. You go find more round holes. So where do you fit, not how do I fit in? And that takes a centered self approach. That very much takes an approach where we're going to put ourselves at I'll use this, it's been overused, millions of times. And again, it's a cliche, but cliches are cliches because they're true. Put your own oxygen mask on first. You can't help others. You can't be what you need to be for others unless you're taking care of yourself. So there is a certain amount, and this is why I came up with the idea of a centered self, because at first, when I started practicing and I would work with my clients, I would talk to them about the need to, understand yourself and be within yourself and pay attention to yourself and so forth. And many people thought that it sounded self-centered. Now, there's a difference. And I absolutely get it. I think when I started to actually acknowledge some of my skills and abilities, there are things I'm damn good at. When I started recognizing those things, because of the things that I knew I wasn't good at, I felt cocky. I felt arrogant. I felt self-centered. Which is exactly the reason why I said, let's take this and turn it on its ear. I don't want to be self-centered. I want to be a centered self. And that's different. That is putting yourself first, yes, in the same way that you're using the oxygen mask. You're putting yourself first so that you can participate in society in a way that's going to be beneficial and productive.
Yeah. I find that with a lot of my clients that maybe have ADHD, sometimes what I hear a lot is, self-deprecation or even shame around, I know I said I would do that, but I haven't, or they operate in chaos. But there's a lot of that, I would say, shame or embarrassment that comes with that. How do you help people with shifting their mindset around ADHD and the effect that has on their work?
Yeah, it really is a self-stigmatization that we participate in. We talk about the stigma of ADHD, but then we also participate in it. When we're ashamed, when we don't talk about it openly. And I understand why, as I said, it's really easy for me to talk about this openly because I'm in the industry, I'm in the business, I wear my ADHD on my sleeve, and that's what I do. For many other, because of the stigma and because of the misunderstanding, and because, here's the thing I tell everybody, because I would get asked all the time by clients, how do I disclose my ADHD to other people? How do I tell my boss? How do I tell my family? How do I tell my friends? Do I disclose it at all? And my advice has always been, you have to make that decision ultimately, but you have to understand that when you disclose this, you are going to own the ignorance of other people. So, and I don't use that word pejoratively. I mean, their ignorance is not their fault. I'm just saying that most people do not understand what having ADHD means. So when you tell somebody that, they have a story in their head already. They have a narrative of what that means. So you better be prepared to also understand and explain it. And you better have enough of a centered self to be able to not just talk about the detriments of ADHD, but to also talk about the positive elements of ADHD. You know, the creativity, the open-mindedness, the intuition, the ability to perform under pressure. I mean, I could go on and on and on. There are many documented characteristics of ADHD that are extremely positive. I don't want to be Pollyanna here. You know, there are also challenges. And I think the people who experience most of the challenges are people who are not understanding, accepting, and embracing what it means to have ADHD. If you fight who you are, life is going to be tough.
Mm,
You know, if you accept who you are and you use it, life gets a little easier.
yeah. Yeah. And I would say personally, since getting an ADHD diagnosis, really understanding, accepting, and embracing my own ADHD, I am a much better business owner. I'm a much better leader. And I think that that has really been a catalyst for a lot of our growth over the last few years because I've mastered myself in some ways. You know what I mean?
Well, when you master yourself, you also master the art of delegation. You know, and you start to recognize, as you recognize things in yourself, you also recognize things in people around you. So as you're assessing your own strengths and your own challenges, you can assess the strengths and challenges of others, and that allows you to develop a roadmap. You know, where do I go? Well, Susan is the best at this. I shouldn't be doing this. Susan should be doing this. You know, what a world it would be if we were all doing what we're good at.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, you know, and we don't. We take on challenges, and sometimes we want to take on challenges because we want to learn. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying that you don't take on any challenges at all. I'm saying quite the opposite. I'm saying be eager to challenge yourself, but be honest with yourself. You know, I could practice all I want. I don't think I'm ever going to dunk a basketball. Like, it's never going to happen. At least not in the traditional way. But when I talk about dunking a basketball, people have an idea in their head what it means to dunk a basketball. I could get a step ladder and climb the step ladder and dunk a basketball. I didn't say it was game situation. I didn't say that it was, you know, there are multiple ways to accomplish a goal. And when we start being open-minded enough to look at all of those different ways to accomplish the goal, and we respect our own ideas, you know, and I'm guilty of this. For years, I thought I was the stupidest person in the room. Always. You know, and therefore I wouldn't open my mouth. So often I would sit there and not say what I wanted to say, wait 20 or 30 minutes, and then hear somebody else say what I wanted to say 30 minutes ago, and now it's gone. You know? So that's why so much of what I do is, at the crux of it, is a centered self. Being able to consider the possibility that I'm not the worst person in the room. Consider the possibility that I'm not the worst person at doing this. Consider the possibility that there are things out there that I'm actually really good at. In fact, better than most other people at, you know? And then start to use that in our decision making. Because if we don't use it in our decision making, if we don't not just believe that, but refer to it when we're making our decisions, then we have a pile of knowledge that we're not using. I mean, we've got, what's the point of the insight if it doesn't get applied?
Yeah.
You know?
So, Brett, I could talk to you all day, and I'm sure we could go on for hours here. But any last thoughts? I guess if someone is hearing this for the first time, what's the one thing that you would love that they take away from this conversation today?
Oh my goodness. Embracing yourself means surprising others. I think that would be it. And we've got to get used to that. I mean, a colleague asked me a few weeks ago, what's the number one issue you see with your clients? I work exclusively with adults who are diagnosed later in life for the most part. And the biggest issue I see are spousal issues or marital issues when the individual who's been diagnosed now wants to honor who they are. And the other person has gotten used to the older version. And that can be difficult. That can be difficult. So be brave enough to take on who you are. Be open enough to involve other people in that process. And be smart enough when it's done to be able to recognize your strengths and equally recognize your challenges. And I think that's, in a nutshell. There's a lot of other stuff that we do, and there's a lot of other ways that we approach things, but I think in a nutshell, that's the goal at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
For that one.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think this has been great. This has been fantastic. Look, I love talking about this stuff. I can talk about.
I know. And I guess on that note, I'm sure our listeners are going to want to learn more about you and connect with you further. So what's the best way for them to get a little more Brett Thornhill in their life?
The best place is my website, brettthornhill.com. There you'll find information about me and what I do, my work. You will also have an opportunity to sign up for a groundwork session if you're interested in working with me. A groundwork session is the very first session I have with any potential client. So yeah, various social media platforms as well. I'm on Instagram, I'm on YouTube. So look for my name and you will find me.
Perfect. And we're going to link Brett on our show notes and social media as well. So be sure to connect with Brett there. And thank you again. I know we've only just scratched the surface here in our conversation, but I think our listeners will really get a lot of value out of this. So I appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate any opportunity to be able to talk about this. The more we can start knocking down the stigma one individual at a time, the better off we'll be.
Absolutely.